The next naval battle, that of Cape Esperance, was sparked off by the dispatch of a reinforced regiment of the American Division to Guadalcanal, in 2 big transports and 8 destroyer types, on 9 October. Admiral Turner commanded this echelon, and Gormley sent up a cruiser group to run interference. The cruisers were commanded, in San Francisco, by Rear Admiral Norman Scott, a young and brilliant flag officer. He had had 3 weeks to give his task force intensive training in night action, and it paid off well. For a week or more, the Japanese had been running nightly Tokyo expresses to northwestern Guadalcanal, and a particularly strong one was due on the night of 11 to 12 October. 2 seaplane carriers and 6 destroyers carrying troops and a vast amount of ammunition and material commanded by Rear Admiral Joshima. In addition, Rear Admiral Goto brought down the slot a bombardment group of 3 heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers. These were reported by a B-17 to Admiral Scott in the early afternoon of the 11th. He built up speed to intercept them west of Savo Island, launched his cruisers' float planes to track them, and Goto was completely surprised when Scott's cruisers opened gunfire at 11:46 p.m. The American task force, 5 destroyers, heavy cruisers San Francisco and Salt Lake City, and light cruisers Boise and Helena, was just executing a countermarch southwest of Savo Island and north of Cape Esperance Guadalcanal, from which this battle is named. The range of Aoba at the head of the Japanese column to Helena was only 4,800 yards. So far, so good, but this might have been called the Battle of Mutual Errors. Scott, fearing that his cruisers were firing on Van Destroyer Duncan, ordered ceasefire only 1 minute after firing began. Fortunately, the American cruiser commanders, emulating Nelson at Copenhagen, turned deaf ears to this order, and their gunners continued to pump shells into the enemy ships. Admiral Goto, thinking that Scott's column was Joshima's reinforcement group, then safely within the Sound, did the same, and ordered his column to turn right. A few seconds later, the Admiral was mortally wounded by a shell explosion near his flag bridge. By that time, both Aoba and Furutaka were burning brightly. At 11:51 p.m. Scott discovered his error and ordered resume firing. 4 minutes later, he swung his column northwest to parallel the Japanese. Partly as a result of Goto's bad guess and sudden death, the enemy never returned an effective fire, and lost cruiser Furutaka and destroyer Fubuki to gunfire and torpedo hits. On our side, Duncan was mortally wounded, and Fahrenholt badly so. Boise was badly pounded by 2 enemy cruisers. Her number 1 turret breached and a magazine exploded. But the luck of the Irish and good damage control saved the Galloping Ghost, as the men called Captain Mike Moran's cruiser, to fight another day. The main action was over at 12:20 a.m. October 12th. In the meantime, Admiral Joshima was setting ashore the contents of his reinforcement group. At 2:50 a.m., a float plane from Boise sighted his formation steaming out of the Sound. Bomber planes summoned from Henderson Field sank 2 of his destroyers, which were combing the scene of the action for survivors. Norman Scott fought the Battle of Cape Esperance with cool, determined courage, and despite an intricate countermarch, never let the situation deteriorate into a melee. He became the hero of the South Pacific during the short month that remained of his valiant life. Unfortunately, because it is human to conclude that the result justifies the means, some fallacious conclusions were drawn from the Battle of Cape Esperance, that the single-column formation was all right, and that American gunfire could master any night battle situation. Actually, Scott's disposition was dangerously unwieldy and prevented the destroyers from exploiting their proper weapon, the torpedo. And because the surprised enemy did not get off his usual torpedo attack, that was assumed to be no longer a serious threat. One learns more from defeat than from victory. The Japanese did accomplish their main mission, landing not only troops but heavy artillery while Goto and Scott were fighting. On the other hand, the 164th Infantry Regiment, American Division, whose journey to Guadalcanal was the reason for Scott's being where he was, landed safely on 13 October, bringing relief to the weary Marines in the perimeter. Tokyo Express for the night of 13 to 14 October was a bombardment mission built around battleships Kongo and Haruna under command of Admiral Kurita. They delivered a 90-minute shoot which killed many Marines, blooded the newly arrived GLs, holed the airfield with yawning chasms, destroyed almost the entire supply of aviation gasoline and 48 aircraft. The bombardment might have lasted even longer, but for the PTs, the first motor torpedo boats to arrive at Tulagi. These piled in against the battleships, shooting and firing torpedoes briskly. And although no hits are recorded, they made Admiral Kurita so nervous, a quality he later showed in greater degree at the Battle off Samar, that he retired at 2:30 a.m. October 14. The following night, of 14 to 15 October, was another bad one for Americans ashore. Admiral Mikawa personally entered Sleepless Lagoon, as the Marines were beginning to call it, in cruiser Chokai, followed by Lucky Kinugasa to churn up the Henderson Field community with 752 8-inch shell and cover the landing of another echelon of troops. Dawn of the 15th revealed a humiliating spectacle. In full view were enemy transports lying to off Tassafaronga, unloading troops and supplies with as much ease as if they had been in Tokyo Bay, and hovering around and over them, destroyers and planes. General Geiger, Marine Air Commander, was told there was no gas at Henderson Field. Then, by God, find some, he roared. Men scoured the dispersal areas, collected some 400 drums of aviation gas from swamps and thickets where they had been cached, and trundled them to the field. Even 2 disabled B-17s had their tanks siphoned dry. By these pint-pot methods, enough fuel was procured to enable planes to make the 10-mile hop to the targets off Tassafaronga and back. Army, Navy and Marine pilots bombed and strafed the transports all day long 15 October, fighting off Zeeks and dodging the darting tongues of anti-aircraft tracers. Flying fortresses flew up from Espiritu Santo and lent a hand. High over the revitalized airfield, Wildcat bullets and anti-aircraft shells brought down 12 bombers and 5 fighters. Everybody who flew claimed damage that day, and for once they were right. 3 large Japanese transports, not yet completely unloaded, had to be beached and became a total loss. By 3:50 p.m. things had become so hot that the Japanese task force commander decided to retire. Not one transport escaped damage. Not one troop unit landed without casualties and loss of equipment. This field day cost the Americans only 3 dive bombers and 4 fighter planes. That night, all hands ashore breathed easier. Even a downpour of 800 8-inch shells from cruisers Miyoko and Maya and 305-inch from Tanaka's destroyers failed to quench the spark of hope, kindled by the feeling that the enemy had done his worst. But alas, he had not. On 15 October, Admiral Nimitz expressed his estimate of the situation in 3 sober sentences. It now appears that we are unable to control the sea in the Guadalcanal area. Thus, our supply of the positions will only be done at great expense to us. The situation is not hopeless, but it is certainly critical. The extremity of the American situation in mid-October is illustrated by gallant, if pitiful, efforts to keep the lifeline intact. Twin-engine Douglas Sky Troopers became flying workhorses. Each brought up from Espiritu Santo about enough gas to keep 12 Wildcats aloft for an hour. Submarine Amberjack, fitted to carry 2,000 gallons of gasoline and 10 tons of bombs, did her part. A barge-towing Allied expedition was made up of 2 cargo ships, motor torpedo boat tender Jamestown, fleet tug Vireo and 2 destroyers, each towing a barge carrying 2,000 barrels of gasoline and 500 quarter-ton bombs. On 15 October, 75 miles from Guadalcanal, these lucrative targets were sighted and reported by a Japanese search plane. The bigger ships hastily returned to Espiritu Santo, but around noon Meredith was sunk by a 27-plane raid from carrier Zuikaku. Mid-October marked the nadir of misery for the American at Guadalcanal. Admiral Nimitz was also confronted with the pressing problem of leadership in the South Pacific. Admiral Gormley, a meticulous, conscientious officer with a long record of achievement, lacked the personal qualities needed to inspire American fighting men in a tough spot. Admiral Nimitz, on 15 October, decided that the critical situation requires a more aggressive commander and named Vice Admiral William F. Halsey. Since May, Bill Halsey had been on the binnacle list with dermatitis, but mid-October found him back to battery. On 18 October, with feelings of astonishment, apprehension and regret, he relieved his old friend Gormley. He brought his own staff, headed by Captain Miles Browning, who had fought under Spruance at Midway. Halsey had already won a reputation for leadership, confidence, and aggressiveness. The announcement that he was now Commander-in-Chief South Pacific was received on board ships of that force with cheers and rejoicing. Other positive measures were taken. Admiral King released from Atlantic Fleet a task group powered by new battleship Indiana, which came through the Panama Canal to the South Pacific. A flock of 50 Army fighter planes migrated from the Central to the South Pacific. 24 submarines were ordered thither. 2 squadrons of Army B-17s droned across the equator to join the brood under Rear Admiral Aubrey W. Fitch, now Commander-Air South Pacific at Espiritu Santo. In Washington, Admiral King had his hands full. Our predicament in the Solomons was more than matched by that of the Atlantic Fleet. German submarines during October sank 88 merchant ships of 585,000 when the rising sun was to be planted on Henderson Field by General Maruyama. The combined fleet, impatiently circling north of the Solomons, would then apprehend and annihilate any powerful forces in the Solomons area, as well as any reinforcements. This reversed the classic strategy of first securing sea control, which the Japanese had tried unsuccessfully in the Eastern Solomons battle. Admiral Yamamoto would better have stuck to Mahan, for the Marines and the GIs refused to be softened, and the stout fight they put up for a week, 19 to 26 October, to defend Henderson Field and the consequent postponement of WWII Day, gave Admiral Kinkaid time to bring up carrier enterprise and take a decisive part in the sea action. The Japanese Guadalcanal garrison, now augmented by the 4,500 troops landed by recent Tokyo expresses, opened attack 20 October against the Marines' western flank on the Matanikau River. This was followed by an enveloping movement against the central and eastern flanks of the American perimeter. Each was beaten off with heavy loss over a period of 6 days. And in this battle for Henderson Field, the GLS proved that they too could defeat jungle-fighting Japanese, if properly trained and led, as indeed they were. Lieutenant Colonel Timbo of the 164th belongs to the Hall of Fame, with Lieutenant Colonels McKelvey, Chesty Puller, Sam Griffith and General Vandergrift of the Marine Corps. During these ground actions there were several minor actions in Iron Bottom Sound, and at least one Tokyo Express failed to deliver the goods, but these were overshadowed by the carrier-fought Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, now making up. Northeast and east of the Lower Solomons are 2 small groups of islands, the Stewarts and the Santa Cruz. The center of the United States Navy's position in this forthcoming battle was about 280 miles east of the one and 125 miles north of the other, roughly 160 miles east of the spot where Enterprise was hit in the Battle of the Eastern Solomons 2 months earlier. The Santa Cruz Islands, glorified as the site of Bali High in the musical comedy South Pacific, were so infested with malignant malaria and so rugged in terrain that the Army engineers sent there early in August to build an airfield had to give up and leave. Admiral Yamamoto, who directed the show from Truk, really expected to clean up this time. He had 4 carriers, 5 battleships, 14 cruisers and 44 destroyers to throw in. He knew that Wasp had been sunk and that Saratoga was under repair, but did not know that Big E was back, under fighting Tom Kinkaid, with South Dakota in her screen. This new battleship, freshly provided with dozens of the new 40mm anti-aircraft guns, was commanded by one of the Navy's most remarkable characters, Captain Thomas L. Gatch. No ship more eager to fight ever entered the Pacific. For the skipper, by constant target practice on towed planes, ignoring lapses in spit and polish, and exercising a natural gift for leadership, had welded his green crew into a splendid fighting team. They looked like a lot of wild men, said one of his officers, and they all adored Tom Gatch. Combined fleet was losing its edge, and the ships were running out of fuel, waiting for the Japanese ground forces to take Henderson Field. A premature paean of victory, later retracted from the liaison officer on Guadalcanal, at 1:26 a.m. October 25, sparked off the naval battle. Yamamoto did not know where the American carriers were, but a far-ranging Catalina from Espiritu Santo sighted Nagumo's spoiled children of victory, carriers Shohaku and Zuikaku, at noon. Kinkaid acted on this contact by launching a combined search strike from Enterprise that afternoon. But they located nothing, as the Japanese had cagily reversed course, again waiting for certain news of victory ashore. In the small hours of 26 October, Admiral Kincaid, who had been steering northwesterly at 20 knots, began to receive plane contacts on enemy carriers 200 miles away. In the grey hours before dawn, Admiral Halsey on Noumea riffled through the dispatches, glanced at his operations chart, and sent out these words: "Attack, repeat, attack." The sun rose at 5:23 a.m. on a fair day. Low broken cumulus clouds scattered over half the sky, the ocean rising and falling in a gentle swell, a languid 8-knot breeze from the southeast, scarcely raising ripples on the sea's smooth surface. It was weather to the taste of dive bomber pilots who could lurk in the clouds, but to the distaste of anti-aircraft gunners, no cloud has a silver lining for them. Already Enterprise had launched a search mission, each dauntless dive bomber armed with a 500-pound bomb just in case. At 7:40 a.m., 2 bomber pilots sighted light carrier Zuiho, used their bombs, and knocked her out so far as this battle was concerned. 1 hour earlier, a Japanese search plane had sighted Hornet. Admiral Kondo, again Japanese officer in tactical command, ordered strikes to be launched at her immediately from his 3 viable carriers. 20 minutes later, Hornet followed suit. The 2 hostile groups passed one another in the air, each eyeing the enemy and wondering which would find a flight deck on its return. Half Enterprise's group was shot down 10 miles short of its target by a dozen Zeeks which had peeled off especially to get them. Now came the most tense moment for the opposing commanders, Kincaid and Kondo. Each had found the other, each was lashing out at the other. Flagship Enterprise was the hub of a tight little circle rimmed by battleship South Dakota, heavy cruiser Portland, anti-aircraft cruiser San Juan, and 8 destroyers. 10 miles to the southeast cruised Rear Admiral George D. Murray's flagship Hornet, similarly surrounded by floating gun platforms. Stacked in layers overhead were 38 fighters of Combat Air Patrol, all under Enterprise fighter direction. The Japanese strike, first to depart, was also the first to arrive at its target. At 8:59 a.m., the American Combat Air Patrol sighted Val dive bombers at 17,000 feet. At about the same moment, Enterprise entered a local rain squall which concealed her from the approaching enemy, but Hornet was in the clear and the enemy concentrated on her, commencing at 9:10 a.m. Vals dove down, loosing a series of explosive bombs. Hornet and her protectors blackened the sky with shell bursts. One bomb hit the starboard side of the flight deck aft. The Japanese squadron commander, crippled by a shell burst, made a spectacular self-terminatory crash. His plane hit the stack, glanced off and burst through the flight deck, where 2 of its bombs detonated. Even more deadly were the torpedo-carrying Kates, which bored in low from astern, slugging nastily at Hornet's tender groin. 2 torpedoes exploded in the engineering spaces. The carrier, in a thick cloud of smoke and steam, lurched to starboard, slowed to a stop, lost all power and communications. She was now immobile, deaf, dumb, and impotent. 3 more quarter-ton bombs hit the flight deck. She was still writhing from this onslaught when a flaming Kate with a doomed pilot made a hurried run from dead ahead, piled into the port-forward gun gallery, and blew up near the forward elevator shaft. In all, some 27 Japanese planes jumped this carrier, and only 2 got home. But that was a cheap price to pay for depriving the Pacific Fleet of 1/3 of its carrier strength. At 9:25 a.m., when Hornet looked like a bad risk, 52 planes of her air group, led by Lieutenant Commander Gus Widhelm, were approaching the Japanese force. 11 bombers under Lieutenant James E. Vosey fought their way through to the pushover point, drew a bead on Shokaku, and roared down through flak with Zeeks still on their tails. It was worth the risk. 3 to 6 100-pound bombs ripped the Japanese carrier's flight deck to shreds, destroyed the hangar, and ignited severe fires. Shokaku was out of the war for 9 months. Hornet's second wave missed the Japanese carriers, but exploded 2 bombs on cruiser Chikuma and knocked her out for a time. Thus, by 10:30 a.m. October 26, 1 large and 1 small Japanese flat top had been scratched, and Hornet almost finished. But Zuikaku and Junyo were still intact, and Admiral Kondo had already ordered their planes to go get Big E. His earlier strike would have done so, but for superb ship handling by Captain Hardison and magnificent shooting by the wild men of South Dakota. She, in this action, secured for battle wagons the place of honor that they occupied during the rest of the war, defending carriers from attack. Enterprise took 3 bombs which killed 44 men, but inflicted no lethal damage on the ship. 40 minutes later, at 11:01 a.m., Jumyo's dive bombers tumbled out of the low overcast. One of them planted a bomb on South Dakota's No. 1 turret. An armor-piercing bomb went right through the thin skin of anti-aircraft cruiser San Juan, exploding below her keel and jamming her rudder. Enemy planes kept dogging Hornet when under tow by cruiser Northampton. She took 3 more hits and had to be abandoned. 2 Japanese destroyers then sank her. Had the later expedient of attaching powerful fleet tugs to each carrier group been in effect, she would have been towed out of enemy range and salvaged. Kondo now shaped a retiring course northward, hoping to renew battle on the 28th, but Kinkaid by that time was too far away for him to make contact. The Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands was over. Measured in terms of sinking, the Japanese could claim victory. The loss of the new, powerful Hornet was serious, and left the United States Navy with only 2 carriers in the Pacific, Sarah and Big E, both under repair. But Japanese air strength had been reduced by about 100 planes and some of the best pilots. The land battle, which the naval battle was supposed to cover, had failed. Moreover, this Santa Cruz set-to gained precious time for the Americans to prepare for the next expected onslaught. As usual, that was not long a-coming. Admiral Yamamoto, contemptuous of earlier air and ground efforts to capture Henderson Field, now issued a new op plan to secure sea supremacy in the Solomons. Admiral Halsey, exasperated over the loss of Hornet, drafted a plan to thwart him. Between 2 and 10 November, the enemy brought in 65 destroyer loads and 2 cruiser loads of troops to western Guadalcanal. One of these detachments, landed at Coley Point east of the American perimeter, was exterminated by the Marines. Henderson field flyers inflicted major damage on 3 destroyers, helped by the Tulagi PT Squadron. Minesweeper Southard sank 1 submarine. But by 12th November, the Japanese garrison on Guadalcanal outnumbered the Americans for the first time. The big American reinforcements, due to arrive on 11 to 12th November, were 3 combat-loaded freighters escorted by Rear Admiral Scott in anti-aircraft cruiser Atlanta with 4 destroyers, and 4 more transport types, including Admiral Turner's flagship Macaulay, escorted by Rear Admiral Daniel J. Callaghan in San Francisco, with 3 more cruisers and 5 destroyers. Since intelligence reports indicated that the Japanese were about to dispatch an exceptionally strong and noxious Tokyo Express, Admiral Halsey deployed 24 submarines in and around Solomon's waters and sent Tom Kinkaid's carrier task force, Enterprise, battleships, Washington and South Dakota, 2 cruisers and 8 destroyers, to cover Turner and counter Yamamoto. If Big E, still under repair at Noumea, could not get there in time, the battleships and 4 destroyers would be detached for independent action, under the command of Rear Admiral Willis A. Lee in Washington. That is exactly what happened, and mighty fortunate that it did. Halsey inadvertently afforded Ching Lee his one big moment in the war, even though he later deprived him of an even greater opportunity in the battle for Leyte Gulf. Scott's reinforcement contingent unloaded successfully on 11 November, and Turner's was about half empty at 1:17 p.m. on the 12th, when word came from a coast watcher at Buin that a formidable flock of fighter-escorted bombers was flying down the slot. Their attack on the transports in Lunga Roads an hour later opened the naval battle of Guadalcanal. This first round resulted very ill for enemy aircraft. Admiral Turner, a past master at handling ships in such manner as to thwart air attack and bring all his own anti-aircraft fire to bear, suffered only slight damage, and helped by Wildcats from Henderson Field, allowed very few of the 2-engine Bettys to return. Tense calm followed the afternoon's elimination shoot. As Turner steamed back to the unloading area through floating remains of downed planes, he realized that the enemy had just begun to show his hand. Abundant intelligence from search planes and coast watchers indicated that the Tokyo Express that night would include 2 battleships and at least 4 cruisers and 10 destroyers, too much for Callaghan's 2 heavy and 3 light cruisers and 8 destroyers to take on with much prospect of success. Yet, with Kinkaid's carrier battleship force too far away to help, there was nothing else to do but for Callaghan to block and block hard. At dusk, 12th November, Turner pulled out his transports, Callaghan escorting them for a few hours, only before he had to return to face the Japanese onslaught. Uncle Dan Callaghan, austere, deeply religious, a hard-working and conscientious officer who possessed the high personal regard of his fellows and the love of his men, had reached the acme of his career. There was something a little detached about this man, since his thoughts were often not of this world. Something, too, that recalled the chivalrous warriors of other days. One could see him as Ossian's dark-haired Dothmaruno, with beetling-browed Turner in the role of Fingal, exhorting him when they parted that night. "Near us are the foes, Dothmaruno. They come forward like waves in mist. When their foamy tops are seen above the low-sailing vapour, sons of heroes call forth the steel." Callaghan passed through Lunga Channel into Iron Bottom Sound, his ships in single column. 4 destroyers were in the van, then cruisers Atlanta, with Rear Admiral Scott embarked, San Francisco, Portland, Helena, and Juneau. 4 destroyers brought up the rear. This disposition was supposed to be best for navigating restricted waters and for ship-to-ship communication, but it prevented the rear destroyers from making an initial torpedo attack, and for reasons unknown. Callaghan did not place in the van 2 destroyers which had the latest surface search radar, the kind that showed a picture on the screen. Fast approaching was a beefed-up Tokyo Express, 2 battleships, screened by a light cruiser and 14 destroyers, under Vice Admiral Hiroaki Abe. Their mission was to knock out Henderson Field and slaughter the Marines with high-explosive shells. Abe was not looking for a naval battle. He assumed that the Americans, as usual, would be gone with the sun, allowing him to prowl the Sound and bombard at will. It was now Friday the 13th, last day of life for 8 ships and many hundred sailors, including 2 rear admirals. The Americans' first radar contact, at 1:24 a.m., showed Abe's battle wagons almost surrounded by his destroyer screen, approaching from the direction of Savo Island. Callaghan did not alter course to cross the enemy's T. That was his big mistake. At 1:41 a.m. destroyer Cushing, leading the American column, sighted 2 Japanese destroyers about to cross her bows. She turned hard a port to unmask her torpedo batteries and avoid a collision. This manoeuvre threw the American column into partial disorder, which in a few minutes' time became almost complete. Now surprise was lost, Callaghan delayed 8 minutes before opening gunfire, owing to the confusion engendered by Cushing's turn and his fear of hitting friends. This gave Abe precious time to change his high-caliber bombardment shells for armor-piercing. If one American shell had exploded on his battleships while their decks were heaped with shells, they would have been destroyed. At 1:50 a.m., just as a Japanese destroyer's searchlight picked up the bridge of Atlanta, she began shooting. Other Japanese destroyers and the 2 battle wagons then deluged the helpless cruiser with shellfire. One snuffed out the lives of Admiral Scott and his staff on the bridge. Atlanta was out of the battle, which now became an unplanned, wild, and desperate melee in black darkness, fitfully lighted by gunfire flashes, torpedo explosions, and star shell. So far as there was any order in this action, it was Callaghan's cruiser column, minus Atlanta, thrusting between 2 battleships, Hii to port and Kirishima to starboard, while destroyers of both sides milled about, shooting at targets of opportunity. Although neither Japanese battleship was hit early in the action, Admiral Abe didn't like it and countermarched. He sank Cushing, which had launched 6 torpedoes fruitlessly at her, and then had a brush with destroyer Laffey, so close that her 14-inch guns could not depress sufficiently to hit the destroyer, whose torpedoes were too close to arm. But Laffey's machine gun fire riddled the battleship's bridge and killed her commanding officer. A Japanese destroyer got a torpedo into Laffey and sank her. Sterrett, next destroyer astern, torpedoed Japanese destroyer Yudichi, and then herself received 3 hits that put her out of the battle. Hie at one time was burning from stem to stern, and she went dead in the water, but Kirishima took only 1 hit. Admiral Callaghan, informed that his flagship San Francisco was shooting at disabled Atlanta, ordered cease-firing own ships. When that order took effect, his ship was the first to suffer. Kirishima and 2 other Japanese ships hurled an avalanche of gunfire at her. Admiral Callaghan and almost every member of his staff, and Captain Cassin Young, were killed. Cruiser Portland, Captain Lawrence Dubose, next astern, took a torpedo hit which bent her stern plates so that they acted as a giant fixed rudder. She could only steam in circles.